episode of the show. I'm flying solo today, so that means I'll predominantly be answering fan questions. So let's get wired in. Keir McNairn, who's a fan of the show and is on his own podcast with Scott Smith, two former guests on the show. He asks, who was your favourite WWF wrestler and why? That's a hard one because I think my favourite ones weren't from the WWF. I think my favourite ones were from WCW, I think it was called back then. I was a huge fan of The Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan. I think they were tag team partners at that time. So yeah, big fan of that. And I was also, when it was WWE, I was a fan of, what was he called again? The Hardy Brothers? Which one was it? Jeff Hardy, that was it. Swanton Bomb. And he wore loads of makeup, so I don't know what that says about me. He also asks, would you prefer to have fingertips for nipples or nipples for fingertips? Whichever way you're going with that, you're going to increase sensitivity, I think. So that is an odd question. Fingertips for nipples or nipples for fingertips? I think having fingertips for nipples would be funnier. You know, you're going to have bigger nipples, just the way it is. And you would have less sensitivity or more. I'm not sure what it's like for guys to exchange those and what the sensitivity ratio is for nipples and fingers. So yes, fingertips for nipples or nipples for fingertips. I'm going to go with nipples for fingertips. He also asks, what did you want to be when you grew up when you were a kid? When you grew up as a kid? I think up until I was 14, I was ready to go in the army. I did cadets for years, army cadets. I don't know if that's a thing other than the UK. That's all I had my mind on. I loved the whole regime and sort of the discipline of it. And that was what I wanted to do. And that's what I was going to be. And I'm glad that I didn't follow that through. You know, I fell in love with music at 14, and that was the career I wanted to pursue after that. But in hindsight, I'm glad that I didn't go down that route, because I think as I've gotten older, I know that I wouldn't want to kill in the army. And it's something you can't really comprehend when you're younger. And I don't know, like I think being older and knowing that I've killed someone in a different country, defending quote unquote my country, the UK, it would just it bear very heavily on me, like it has for a lot of soldiers that have come back. That's something that you can't erase from your memory or your mind, or even, I don't believe in souls, but even your soul, you're not going to get rid of that. That's something that's there. I mean, it probably wasn't a big deal back in the day when you were trying to defend your village, but going over to another country and actually taking some other person's life, that's a whole different ball game, especially when you don't know the politics of it all. You know, it's your government that's going in there. It's not, you don't have any beef with these people that you're going over to another country. Just meddling in affairs and not taking account of that is tough. And you know, the military do a great job over here. You know, no one's saying that is a bad decision to go to be in that occupation. But for me, that would have been something. You know, I wanted to be a sniper as well, which would have been even worse. You know, because I would have seen up close, or through a scope up close, what I'm doing precisely. And that would have been something that I would have found tough to live with. So I'm glad I found music. And after that, I think it was music for up until I was 18, but I did want to be a vet. Mixed in with all that was going on at the same time. Music, a musical veterinarian. If I could have merged both of them together, I doubt that. There's probably someone on YouTube that's doing that right now. But yeah, I always loved animals. I came from the countryside, so I was always around it. But I did grow up shooting and hunting for rabbits, and I think as I got a little bit older, I did a little bit of shooting deer. I can't remember. I would have known if I had. But yeah, which is a bit, you think of it as a bit of an oxymoron to hunt animals and want to be a vet, but you know, coming from the countryside, that's that life. Those things are sort of mixed together. Yeah, I don't want to get into that whole conservation argument. It's not really something that's over here, but there are people who hunt in different countries. It's a whole other argument. So yeah, that's what I wanted to do when I was growing up. Scott Smith asks, what was the last good Metallica album? And if there is one, I'm not sure. You guys can probably tell me. Growing up in music, I didn't really take to Metallica for some reason. I had a few friends in the band I was in. They loved Metallica, but I just couldn't get into them. I'm not sure why as well, because it seems like it's a no-brainer for the type of music I played at the time, metal. But I was more into Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath, and that took over my life. So I didn't really have any room for Metallica, as it were. But I am aware of what albums there are out there, and I do have a preference. I would say, I mean, it's going to be pretty obvious, but I would say Ride the Lightning is my favourite one, because it has some classic tracks on there. From Whom the Bell Tolls, everyone's played that one. Fade to Black, another classic. Ride the Lightning, obviously the self-titled, and Creeping Death, and the Call of Cthulhu. I forgot that was even a thing. It's an amazing instrumental. But yeah, that is, for me, that's their solid album. And obviously they've released terrible albums in the last couple of years. I think their last one, all bands do this thing where it's like, we're going back to roots. We're going to play the music that got us here, but ultimately it never goes that way. You put your life and soul into your first couple of albums, maybe even on only your first album. It's your whole life experience up until that first album. So there's so much to say, and ultimately your second and your third one, if you do become famous, are just usually garbage. I'm not saying Metallica were like that, because they had classic albums after their first three. But yeah, it's just how can you relate to someone or a group of people in a band that become millionaires? And this is always something that happens to any artist, music or just art in general. No one can relate to you if you're some millionaire trying to talk about doing these millionaire type things, you know, driving flashy cars. There's no yearning or aching of your soul in your lyrics, because you don't have as many problems. That's not to say you don't have problems as a millionaire, but when it comes to creating art, it's hard to bleed your soul that way when there's less issue in your life. And it takes special artists to come out and make classic albums once they become very, very popular. I can't even think of any off the top of my head. Maybe you guys can pop in and let me know. But yeah, Ride the Lightning is probably my favourite one. Harvey Robinson, He asks, what's one of your favourite films that moved you personally or struck a chord that seemed to have little effect on other people, and why? That's a hard question. I don't think I have been moved by a movie that's not had an effect on other people. I think one movie that I feel bad about mentioning was The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise. There was a scene at the very end, and I struggled to sort of hold back anything that was coming out because it was just so emotive. Great scene. I think it's especially when he's he's getting handed the sword in the last scene, or he's handing that over to the emperor. And it was a hard movie to come to terms with that made me feel something like that. Because it's Tom Cruise in The Last Samurai, you don't expect that to happen, and then you feel bad for feeling this way about his type of movie. I don't think anyone's felt anything other than just the feeling of sitting in a popcorn movie when you see his movies recently. Supposedly the new Mission Impossible is great, but I've not seen it yet. So yeah, it's hard to figure out a movie that's moved me personally, struck a chord with me, didn't have any effect on other people. Maybe I found movies funny that other people haven't. No, I can't really think. So I'll go with The Last Samurai as the movie that has sort of made me quite teary at the end. I didn't cry, obviously, but that did make me feel something at the end of it, and I felt terrible that it was a Tom Cruise movie. So I'll put this in there. Lewis Penny asks, should prisoners be allowed to vote? I think yes. I don't think there should be any question around it. You shouldn't be devoid of your rights as a person, like fundamental rights as a person when you get put in prison. You've been obviously tried by jury and trial, and you should have an appropriate punishment put forward to you, and you have to serve that. And if you serve it, that's you've done that, and that should be the end of it. You shouldn't have to have your sort of basic rights to pulled away from you, which is hard to argue when it comes to prisoners. There's levels and degrees of people's crimes, and if you take away the vote from them, then they don't get a chance to have a say in the country they're in, and they can't help that. You can't choose which country you're banged up in, so you should have some sort of say. So I would say prisoners should be allowed to vote. I mean, that just seems to me like it's quite obvious. Thoughts on the death penalty? Oh, this is a bit of a heavy one, actually. I'll just look at when the last death penalty was in the UK. So the last execution was in England on the 13th of August 1964. Peter Anthony Allen and Walton Prison in Liverpool, and Gwyn Owen Evans at Strangeways Prison in Manchester were executed for the murder of John Allen West. So that's 1964. So capital punishment has been illegal in the UK for over the last 50 years. It's a weird one when you see that in the US, that they still use that sort of form of that's someone's punishment for whatever crime they commit. It's just should we err on the side of caution when it comes to people who are sent to prison and or given the death sentence? Should we say, look, there might be something that comes out later, and we know that people have been exonerated because DNA evidence has come out. A small proportion of people, obviously, but it still happens. And can you knowingly say yes to capital punishment if you find out later that they were innocent all along? I mean, it's like the same with going off and fighting in Iraq and killing people. Like, it's going to weigh heavy on your mind that you've said, this guy's going to be killed by the state for a crime that he didn't commit. And I don't know if I can feel good about that. So I'm glad that in the UK this is something that we don't do anymore. And there's a lot of argument to bring it back. There's you always see people on Facebook crying, we need to send these paedophiles to the death chamber and the gas chamber, and they should be hung and drawn and quartered or whatever. And I'm not defending that, because that is like a whole special case by itself. Yeah, I mean that is one, like, I can't even think about what would be right or wrong for that instance. But there's a finality to death, obviously, and you can't take that back once you've handed that punishment out to someone that you think has committed a crime. And if it turns out they haven't, it's not good. I mean, I couldn't put that on someone and on myself. So yes, no capital punishment. I'm good with it in the UK the way it is. Right, on to the next question. Who wins, Khabib or Conor? I've talked about this with plenty of guests on the podcast recently, because it's a big thing. It's coming up. I think it's less than a month. 2 seconds. The 6th, maybe. 229. So yeah, it's going to be on the 6th of October 2018. So less than a month. Man, this is going to be so good. This card's looking so good already. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I listen to some people on YouTube talking about Khabib, whether it's Chael Sonnen or DC, and they're all like, there's no way that Conor is going to even get near knocking Khabib out. And then I watch a bunch of videos on Conor, and then I think it's BJJ Scout does a really good breakdown of Conor's footwork and his left hand and his strategy and his mental toughness as well. Well, his mental games, not his mental toughness. Yeah, it's hard. Like, I end up just going with whichever one wins me over. Who do I want to win? I think Conor. That's who I want to win. Whether that's going to happen, I'm not sure. It could be that one person's going to dominate that fight, but we don't know which one. Conor's either going to be superior, like we think, and his striking's just going to take over in this match. And Khabib, we've seen him strike, and it's not impressive. But that's what happens when someone's so specialised in an art form that's so dominant. You can kind of let these things go to the wayside. So yeah, and then Khabib, his takedowns are monstrous. He takes them against the cage, starts working for single legs, takes you down, just grinds you, doesn't submit you, just peppers you with these shots that grind you and break you. You can see these guys getting up and their mind is broken. And I think he uses his opponent's toughness against them. I think Barboza was one of the big examples of that. Barboza was so mentally tough that he just endured this punishment from Khabib. You could see it in his eyes when he got up, but he wouldn't give in, and that was just so much harder to watch. And I'm not sure if that's just an effect of what Khabib's doing, or it's something that he's he knows he's doing. You know, he's going in there and just grinding these guys out and making it look even more impressive, because these guys just won't give up. But he just is so controlling in these fights. So yeah, I want Conor to win. I don't know how to call it. You know, it's anyone's guess. It could be when we get to that fight, we're going to be like, like it goes completely the other way, but we're like, this was so obvious. Like, obviously, so and so would have dominated this fight. I think it'll go like that, but I don't think anyone really knows. But after the fight, we'll be like, yeah, I kind of knew it was going to go like that. So I hope that gives you an idea of how I'm thinking on the fight. And we've not really seen any press for this fight either, which is strange. I think the story and the word on the street is Conor is refusing to, whether that's true or not. I think he's maybe just doing the right thing of knowing he's going to fight this monster in a beast, that someone who could easily, if they fought maybe 10 times out of 10, I think those like 6 or 7 times it could go one person's way, either way. Yeah, and there's a press conference next week, I think, with the two, so that should be exciting. But hopefully we can see some smack talk, because that's what Conor's known for. This is the big draw of Conor when he's fighting, is his smack talk, and we've seen none of this. And I think that's going to have an effect maybe on the pay-per-views, whether this conference next week sparks this new fire for Conor. I just think we need that trash talk. But he might think, I've done so much promotion for the company that I don't need to do this. You know, I'm going to focus on my fight with an absolute monster, come up with a game plan and try to execute it. Yeah, I think he's more than welcome to do that. He's gave the sport so much in terms of being highlighted by a larger audience, which wouldn't have happened, you know. So I think he should have that right to take his time, not do as much media, and be in the right frame of mind for this fight. But then he might be thinking about it too much, and it'll take over his life. Okay, another question from Brian Gallagher, a former guest on this show. If you had to choose fascism or communism, which would you support? I don't really want to support any of those things, but like these two things, they all start out the same way. You know, they're separate ideologies. They have their own things going on. You can read into it yourself if you want to know the difference. But as these things progress, ultimately, the things that supposedly separate them are purely superficial. You know, these things become the same thing. One person gets in power and it becomes a dictatorship. Doesn't matter what name you put over it. Fascism, you know, is known for being a dictatorship. Communism on paper, I've said this a lot, is a good idea, but it never gets executed the way it should be. I don't know if that's the right word. It doesn't get executed the way the intentions start out. And ultimately one person ends up in power, and that's not good. You know, even with the government that we have, it seems like too few people to run a country effectively. You know, you get one idea that is used to rule that part of the world, and that's not good. You know, we need as much influence and input into ruling. I don't like that word, ruling. Running a company. You know, we need to draw from all these different places and effectively execute, not people, but structures and policies and politics. So yeah. But for the shits and giggles, I'll go with communism. Seems like a bunch of fun. Bad Mac 999 on Instagram asked, "Who is your favorite actor and why?" Oh man, I'm a bit of a purist when it comes to my favorite actor of all time, and it seems a bit obvious. A lot of people say this because he's made some phenomenal movies. I'd say Daniel Day-Lewis, and I'd seen him in a lot of movies when I was younger, the ones that he's released, but I didn't know who it was. I was a big fan of Last of the Mohicans. My Left Foot, that was one that we saw in high school, and I didn't really take in that this who it was, because he changes so much from character to character. It's hard to believe that he's the same person at the end of, all the things that he's played. Yeah, like if you just want someone that is the quintessential actor and what you think an actor should be, he's like out in the fucking woods trying to rub sticks together to make a fire just to prove to himself that he can be this character in Last of the Mohicans. He supposedly was a street cobbler. That's what he does in his spare time. And he gets so involved in these parts. And I just assumed that that's what every actor aspired to be and do. If you want to take it seriously and to be the ultimate actor, then you have to do method acting. Dustin Hoffman and these type of people all subscribe to that. But there's only one guy that really pulls it off, and it's Daniel Day-Lewis. And there's arguments to be made that his last couple of movies are not that great. But I don't think so. I think his whole body of work speaks for itself. He's like notoriously doesn't do interviews, really hates being in the limelight. Maybe that's why he does acting so much, because it gives him a vehicle to interact with the world. He's notorious for shutting himself off when he is not filming a movie. I think he stays over in France. You never hear from him. You never hear any interviews. And then when he is doing a movie, he barely does any then. So he must be kind of a nightmare for the production companies, because he's not really doing the press for these movies, and he's the draw. Everyone goes to see that movie because of him. And as to why, I think I kind of answered that partially, but I don't know. He's it for me. When you see all of his movies, and I haven't seen his latest one. Not sure what the name is. It's bad when your favorite actor and you don't even know his latest movie. But yeah, he's just so great at evoking a character that he's built for months and almost years in preparation for a movie. He becomes that part. And supposedly he's absolute arse on set as well, because he refuses to leave character. I think one of the stories of that is My Left Foot. And I think he plays a disabled Irish writer who was born, he couldn't use his, I'm not sure exactly what was wrong with him, but he couldn't write and he couldn't speak because there was something not totally right with his hands, and so he would use his left foot to write. And he lived in like a poverty-stricken part of Ireland. So trying to deal with someone who's your child, who's obviously disabled as well, it's just, can't even imagine that. So he gets frustrated and he tries to communicate with the world by writing with his feet. Obviously the name My Left Foot. There's a fantastic version on Family Guy if you look it up as well. Yeah, and he refused to come out of character on the movie set, and they would have to like pick him up in a wheelchair over the cables on set, and he just was like, no, I'm staying in this character. He wouldn't say that, but I guess he would in his head. Yeah, so Daniel Day-Lewis. Hope that answered that question. Okay, another question. from Run the Jewels 88 on Instagram. Favorite early era MMA fight and which promotion? That's a doozy. There's something about the early 2000s in MMA that just click with me. I loved all the stuff that was previous, the UFCs that were in the 90s as well, and then there's a lot of Vale Tudo stuff that was around then in Brazil, and then the Japanese promotions. But for me, the era has to be from 2002 all the way through like 2006. That was like the prime for me, at least, because it was when I started to when I went back when I was into MMA. That's when I just watched it from those fights, because it wasn't too old that it looks shit, you know, and you could still relate to it on the screen. So I think my favorite early fight for me has got to be Fedor versus Randleman. I'll just check to see that is, so I'm not talking out my ass. Yes, so I think they fought 2 seconds. It was in Pride. Critical Countdown 2004, and that was in Japan. I think it was the heavyweight Grand Prix quarterfinal. Yeah, so Fedor, who's like this Russian mythological beast. Randleman looks like just an absolute monster as well. He's just has his muscles on muscles, and his traps are huge. And I think he dyed his hair like sort of gingery blonde at the time. Randleman's like this big black guy, so you can see him from a mile away with this massive gingery yellow curly hair. And he fought this guy that was sort of a mythical beast within the Pride organization, even in MMA as a whole. You know, he'd be hyped up so much, and he was this Russian guy who gives you the criminal stare, you know, when he's across the other side of the ring at the time. And it was a great move. It was a great fight, and I think it was one of the first ones I had saw, and I felt like Fedor, you know, he got I think he got like some sort of power slam. I think it was a suplex actually, and Randleman, you know, he's a wrestler and he's a monster, so much muscle, and he suplexes Fedor on his fucking head, and it looked like he was dead. But when he hit the ground, didn't even batter an eyelid. You know, he swung his body round, got back into guard, and then eventually got a Kimura on Randleman. And I thought, this guy's a stone cold killer. You know, nothing's going to rattle him. Since then, we've seen some of his losses. I think that's just due to age. Comes to us all. Some more quickly than others. And yeah, that was my favourite fight from that era, I think. And it was just and the thing I loved about the Japanese promotions was that, how do I put this? They're so sort of respectful of what they're watching. Maybe it's a stereotype or whatever, but you can see it in action when you watch these older fights. They sit there silently, and there's no shouting, there's no drunken boisterousness, there's not these people fucking ripping their shirts off and throwing beer across the cage or the ring. They just sit there and enjoy the experience. And I think that was one of the things that I loved about Pride, and it was so alien to me. You know, anytime you go to a boxing match here in the UK, back then even, it was an organised street fight outside, always. You know, and especially on the amateur level. So to see that from a crowd, and once I started to understand the technical side of it, you would hear a round of applause when someone moved position. And at the time, I was just like, I don't know why they're clapping. Like, did the ring girl take her top off or something? But no, they just understood the game so well and understood technique. And when someone gained a superior position, you just hear like a round of applause, and that was just amazing to me. They understood the game as a whole and as a crowd as well, because generally you don't get that, and I think it doesn't even happen in the UFC when it's in the US at this point. You don't hear those type of cheers for someone transitioning from one position to the other. It's just, if it's too much on the ground or up against the fence, people just start booing. And that's not good for the sport. You know, you want to, I don't know how you would make, I don't even know how you would educate people on the sport. And I think this is the difference between Westerners and the Japanese culture and the Chinese culture is you don't have to do a sport like that to understand the rules and understand positions. And I think that is something that happens over here and in the US, that the only time that you ever understand something is if you actually do it. And that's kind of lends itself to Japanese culture. You know, that's one of the amazing things is when you see them clapping over someone transitioning to a half guard, or someone pulling guard and getting maybe a funky submission. So yeah, that's one of my favorite fights of all time, and you can't not love it. It's just so amazing to see this guy that was, I think he was undefeated or maybe had a loss on his record at that time. It's a bit hairy because coming up in those organizations in Russia, you could fudge your record a little bit, I guess. But to see what it looked like on the edge is Fedor being on the cusp of being pretty much knocked out on your head by a suplex, and it just didn't happen. You know, he didn't batter an eyelid. He just swung round, got a submission. You know, it was fantastic to see. And then you were like, oh yeah, he's never going to get beat. But you know, obviously that doesn't hold true. I hope that answers your question. Okay, last question, I think. Do you like hummus? And that is Zolteros_fire. Do I like hummus? Yes. Love hummus. Who doesn't like hummus? Unless you mean Hamas, then no. Those two get confused a lot, but no, I don't know why you would ask that, because I freaking love hummus. So yeah, that's it. This is the questions for this episode. Short one. Just some filler. Oh, killer. No filler, should I say. Yeah. And thank you for joining me, and thank you for putting forward your questions for this episode. I hope they were all answered adequately, and I will see you the next episode. Peace.